The Word of God has world-altering power. The word you read are more than just words, but have the power to create worlds and alter what we see and experience. The world was brought into existence when God spoke a word. When God spoke, that which was nothing became into being. The Word of God, the Logos of God, the divine imagination of God, the breath of God, the Ruah of God, the Pneuma of God, the will of God, the pneumatological action of God. The power of life and death is in the tongue, that what you speak can become reality. Be careful about what you say, and be careful of who you are around, because what they say may become manifest in your life. Words or sounds, if you want to understand neurologically, as I mentioned, enter our body from the outer ear, make its way into the ear canal and then to the tympanic membrane and then the cochlear nerve, where hair or cilia cells wave back and forth, where simple signals are then sent to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex acts as a computer that determines the high frequency, low frequency, and tries to determine what those sounds are, if they are sounds or if they are actually words. This is how we hear. Now, how we understand words and their meaning still has a degree of mystery, but science has given us a roadmap. Just go with me. The language center sits on the left side of the brain. Music has a small place on the right side, but in order to understand music, one has to use all perspectives and sides of one's brain, and scientists still do not quite understand how we process music. Music utilizes all parts of the brain. Language lives on the left side. One little section of how we understand music is on the right. And if one wants to utilize music to stimulate language, if you have a stroke and therefore the left side of the brain is not working, you can utilize melodic intonation therapy to move things from the left side of your brain to the right side of your brain, because your brain has the ability to rewire itself. When the brain recognizes words, chemicals are released, and one chemical released is known as dopamine. When words are affirming, positive, and uplifting, dopamine coats and codes the memory of those words or the person who said those words. So when you see that person visually or hear their voice, your brain has a memory that that person brings affirming things in your life, and then chemicals are released, and therefore you have a good feeling when those words enter into your spirit. But when words enter your brain, in your spirit, that are negative, they enter the same way through the outer ear, the canal, the tympanic membrane, the vibrating cochlea, the hair cells that send signals to the cerebral cortex and then sends a signal out into the brain. But something happens that's different when there is a negative word in your life. A chemical is released known as cortisol. Cortisol then registers as where you get stress. Whenever there is stress in your spirit or in your body, cortisol is being released in your body. When you visually see a person you associate with negativity, there is an overabundance of cortisol being released in your body that's telling you you need to stay away from that person because they will bring a degree of stress in your life. And literally, the cortisol, when there's an overproduction, will then weaken your immune system. when there's an overproduction of the cortisol, you then lower your mortality. It gives new meaning to the word, you make me sick. That literally, if you are around the wrong person, that there is a physiological reaction that can make you sick. Neurologically, the brain is creating memories around cortisol, causing a level of stress or feeling of negativity because a person, an institution, a sound, or even colors associated with that person give you a negative feeling. And the writer of Psalm 107 is writing to a community that has post-exile syndrome or post-traumatic stress. The Israelite community is dealing with the trauma of colonization. Colonization is the experience of having your life, assets, wealth, and culture controlled by another community. Life is defined by the colonizer's standards. Existence is defined by the person who placed you in exile, that is occupying your country or your space, or has removed you from your homeland and placed you somewhere that is a foreign and alien environment. Life is defined by the colonizer's standards. Existence is defined by the person who placed you in exile. And when people have post-exile stress, when they have post-traumatic stress, or they have post-emancipation stress, whenever they have stress like that, then interclass rivalry begins within the community. Because the colonizer will take one group of people and allow them to rise to a certain level because they can be a part of the colonizer's institutions and because they are to be representatives to keep the masses in order. And this is the way that the Assyrians and the Babylonians treated the Israelites. The wider culture would accept those who had graduated from Assyrian or Babylonian university. It was common within Hebraic culture then also to learn how to code switch if you were in a colonizing culture. What does code switching mean? It means I can speak like a Babylonian, but when I get around my mama, I can switch back to the way that we talk at home. Because I learned how to live within two different cultures because I'm in a post-traumatic, post-exile situation. And post-exile, post-traumatic, post-emancipation stress. This is what the psalmist was writing about and writing to in post-exile community. The reason I gave you neurological information is because when the community lives in post-exile with post-exile, post-syndrome, or post-traumatic stress, or post-emancipation syndrome, your brain produces synapses that have an overproduction of cortisol, which causes memories to be associated negatively with one's environment, culture, and history, and people who look just like you. But in order to decolonize the mind, the psalmist is decolonizing the Israelite mind. The writer, the psalmist, is using language which finds a resting place, go with me, on the left side of the brain. The colonized mind has memories with a high degree of cortisol associating everything that they have done as negative. The psalmist wants to decolonize the Israelites' mind by replace and crowd out the cortisol with dopamine of affirming positive perspectives and a worldview to recognize that God made you in God's image. If my mind only has trauma wrapped in its long-term memory, if my mind only views the world from the eyes of a subjugated person of exile, there will be an overabundance of cortisol. Which means then that when you move into an aspect of depression. And you will see anyone who looks like you as someone to be hated, dismissed, shot, killed, robbed. But if you want to get out of the cortisol, then you think you can get out of it by joining organizations, street organizations, gangs. Then they will give you a boost of dopamine temporarily, but they never get rid of the cortisol that has become permanent in your synapses. An overproduction of cortisol will decrease your mortality and increase your vulnerability to disease. The writer of Psalm 107 is not just rewriting liturgy, but the psalmist is literally, through poetic structure and musical intent, rewiring the neurological pathways of the brain. Where you going, Moss? Just give me a minute. You see, this text here is what is called an enthronement festival text. The psalmist is writing in the style of enthronement, or the installation as God as king. This installation as King Yahweh. The words speak to the left side of the brain and cause the reader to produce not cortisol, but dopamine. The creation of new synapses in the brain. I'm now crowding out my old memories of post-traumatic stress. I've got new memories of God and God's steadfast love. God's love is now active in my life, and now I'm producing more memories, not based upon my colonizer, but based upon the God who created me. And this psalm is speaking to the language center on the left side of the brain. But in order for me to move into a new era, I just can't have the left side of my brain to understand what's going on. The right side must also be used. And so when the psalmist wrote, he used a poetic structure, but he also wrote it so that it would be musically structured. So it's poetry and music simultaneously. So when you read the words, it's on the left side of your brain. But when you read them and sing them, it's now on the right side of the brain. And so now both sides of the brain are being used in rewiring the entire spirit to understand that the last word does not come from the Assyrians nor from the Babylonians. And so the psalmist uses music and speaks to all aspects of the brain. And people of African descent understood the idea of how music can rewire and rework your spirit, just as our ancestors did when they said, before I be a slave, I will be buried in my grave. The psalmist uses the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. The psalmist is rewiring the brain chemistry through poetic structure, the structure of the psalm, by telling people to give thanks and sharing his steadfast love that endures forever. Yahweh is placed at the center of ultimate concern. God is being installed, and Yahweh is the center of the universe. No longer is it Assyria, and no longer is it Babylon. The song of poetry and music structured around two stanzas that would repeat in the psalm. The two repeating stanzas are, they cried out to the Lord, and the other one, let them give thanks to the Lord. That when you read the whole thing, the thing that keeps repeating is, they cried out to the Lord, let them give thanks to the Lord. It keeps repeating. Two auditory commands are given here, are required by people who are in exile, who want to move from having all that cortisol and those memories of what their colonizer did. They've got to give thanks to the Lord and cry out to the Lord. And the brain is being rewritten. What is happening is that there is a public cry for God to intervene in a personal matter. That, in other words, that if you want God to intervene in your life, you cannot be silent nor suffer in your silence. You have to open up your mouth and let God know what's going on in your life. Because if you are silent, you may not receive any help.